Good afternoon to all of you on the states side of this, and we're glad that Judah. I know it's already nighttime for you over in Israel, but I'm really grateful for all of you being able to join us, and especially grateful to our speaker for helping to pull this together in a pretty quick turnaround. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm going to sort of really throw this over to him to try to explain. I'm barely even know the questions to ask because there's still so much about this story that I don't understand. So I'm going to give it over to our speaker, and then we can have a Q&A or some conversation. And so I know that Judah will be open to questions at the end. You can put questions in the chat. He'll be looking at the chat. I'll be looking at the chat. We'll try to cover as much of this as possible. And right after I do the introduction and give this over to our speaker, I'll also put into the chat a link to the article that Judah wrote about all of this. So I sent that in advance if you had a chance to read it. If you didn't, you can save it and read it after, although maybe there's even more to it than what was in the article. I don't really know. So let me introduce our speaker. Judah Gross is the military correspondent for the Times of Israel. He joined the website in 2015 following a 2-year stint as a photographer in the IDF. He was born and raised in Philadelphia, and he graduated from the University of Maryland with a bachelor's degree in journalism and then moved to Israel. Judah now lives in Zichron Yaakov with his wife Anna and their son Tavor and their dog Lucy. So Judah, let me just say, when this story was unfolding, it was happening also in the midst of all of the Ben and Jerry's controversy, which I think kind of, took over the American Jewish media more so than this story. But everything that I was reading about it had everyone saying that this was going to be the biggest story of the year. Is this still the biggest story of the year? Like, what is Pegasus, and why is this such a huge story?
Okay, so Pegasus is a program that was created by a company called NSO Group. NSO Group does sort of cybersecurity and cyber surveillance, and Pegasus is an incredibly powerful program that essentially gives the user of it, which is various countries around the world, full access to the phone that it's used on. So in the past, somebody, if a country wanted to install this on someone's phone, they had to send a link and someone had to click on it. Over time, the company's gotten better at developing it, and now they can basically install this on someone's phone without that person knowing. They don't have to open a link or download a file or anything like that. And it gives them complete access effectively to a person's phone. That means they can read text messages, record phone calls. They can also turn on the camera when you don't realize it and record you doing things. They can record audio. It's sort of the ultimate in hacking and taking over a person's device. And obviously this is good if you are looking for a terror cell, or a drug dealer. You can sort of record their movements. You can see who they're talking to. You can figure out, an entire, the inner workings of some kind of a drug cartel or a terror cell or something along those lines. But it's also terrifyingly useful against political activists that they're in contact with, journalists to find out who their sources are. And now the company sort of bills itself, says that its program Pegasus is supposed to be used for fighting terror, for fighting crime, against drug dealers. Again, I don't mean a guy selling weed on the corner. I mean, large, international, drug cartels, and pedophiles, and really the worst of the worst. But what came out last month was that there were a number of countries using it for sort of the latter things, against political activists, against political opponents, against journalists. And somewhat more shocking, I think one of the more shocking things is that it was not necessarily being used against the top line biggest names, though there were a number of big names involved. It was being used against journalists that you've never heard of. This wasn't, the biggest and baddest thing. This was being used sort of pretty flippantly against relatively unimportant people, which shows sort of how much this was potentially being abused. Now, just to give a little bit of background about how this all came out, this was through a consortium of different news outlets around the world who sort of all got together and worked with Human Rights Watch. The company has denied a lot of the allegations, but not necessarily everything. And so this came out in a series of articles throughout the world, in the Washington Post, Le Monde, and others. So I don't have direct access to the underlying documents that sort of led to these this expose, but more sort of how I see this is now made more difficult by the fact that this is sort of a surveillance product, but this is part of Israel's overall sort of arms deals, which it's done for decades and decades, and often, or not, in a number of cases, to countries that should give us pause that Israel was willing to sell weapons to them. So I think it's there's like in terms of, is this going to be the big story of the year? I don't think there's a lot going on in the world right now, and various countries known for human rights abuses doing bad things is not necessarily sort of the biggest story of the year. I would have hoped that this would have spurred a greater conversation in Israel about the morality and political efficacy of these kinds of arms sales. It's happening to a certain extent, but not necessarily to the level that I would have hoped for. I think partially just because there's so much else going on in the world that people don't have the attention to really put into this, because this is sort of a real structural issue that's going on. But there are some things that have happened since then that show that Israel is at least looking into this case, if not necessarily sort of an overall overhaul of its defense exports. So I can speak a little bit more, but I kind of want to, I can sort of go in a bunch of different directions. So I'd like to sort of hear what's of interest, and I can sort of go in those different ways.
Well, let me, if I can follow up with a couple of questions, and then, Bob, was that you waving for a question? So, well, you're muted. Let me just clarify one thing, and then I can toss it to you. So when you say Israel, so NSO is an Israeli company. So are we talking about private deals that are happening within a corporation, or to what extent are we talking about governmental policy when you start talking about defense deals? So can you clarify the relationship between those?
Sure. So the way this works, NSO Group is a private company. There are some other defense contractors that either in their past or currently are state-run, but NSO Group is a private company. The way it works in Israel is, in 2007, there was a law passed that sort of updated Israel's defense exports control. And there's a body within Israel's defense ministry that is supposed to oversee defense exports, and it's supposed to sign off on different ones. And now, so if a company wants to make a deal with, name a country, with Azerbaijan, they have to get approval in order to do that. So they would go to this body in the defense ministry, and they would say, we are trying to sell, these drones to Azerbaijan. And then this body within the defense ministry, which is ridiculously understaffed, and is tasked with reviewing sort of thousands of these export licenses, would then review the deal, and it's supposed to, I believe I'll give the exact language that's in the law. It's supposed to make considerations regarding the end user or the end use of the weapon. So there's nothing in there that says if it's a country that has human rights abuse, you can't sell to them, or anything like that. It just says, you're supposed to take into consideration how this product is going to use or who is going to use this. So Israel can't sell something to Azerbaijan if it knows that Azerbaijan is just going to turn around and sell it to Iran. You have to know who the end user of your product is, and that's worked out in agreements and understandings. So there is sort of government oversight on these types of defense exports, which is why it gets into territory of, even though this is a private firm, the Israeli government is sort of directly involved in permitting the sale. And then in some cases, and in some of the cases specifically in NSO Group, the government encouraged, or at least sort of with a nudged in favor of NSO Group selling these things in order to shore up some diplomatic relations. So some of the countries that were sort of outed in this expose were the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, countries that now Israel is normalizing ties with, but when a lot of these deals were happening, Israel had not yet normalized ties. And this was sort of a way, in general, Israel sees defense exports as a tool of diplomacy, and that this is a way to sort of ingratiate ourselves to different countries if we're trying to improve ties or normalize ties, or start things from scratch. And so there's always sort of a bit of overlap in terms of private companies that are just sort of versus the government that's sort of pushing these things for diplomatic and political reasons.
And just to also, I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly. So you're talking about this as a weapon. So this is not something that is being misused. Like, this was specifically built as a weapon. Is that correct?
So if I understand correctly, the original use of Pegasus was for like way long ago. In terms of the company's history, it was sort of a way for if you were having phone trouble, that a technician could sort of see what was happening on your phone. That's sort of how it started. And then somebody very quickly realized the potential in that technology. And that's when it sort of very quickly became a tool of surveillance and not a way for a technician in somewhere else to help you when your phone wasn't working properly. But this is, in terms of the controls on it, this is considered a cyber weapon, a surveillance weapon.
Okay, well, thank you. Bob, I think you wanted to ask a question, and I see you're unmuted. Did you?
Yes, and I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
I could barely hear. I have to hold it very close to hear it. So it may already have been covered by Judah, but I'll ask it again in my mind. What is the most effective way to combat this, or is there any effective way to prevent this from being abused?
Okay, so the main way to prevent this from being abused is legislation in Israel that would give the defense ministry and give the government more control over what types of things are being sold and to whom. So Azerbaijan does not have a good human rights record in terms of respecting civil liberties. So you sort of have to know that selling a cyber surveillance tool to Azerbaijan is potentially problematic and is likely to be abused. In part because the way that sort of Israel does things now is it sort of defines. It will say that it is only allowing NSO Group to sell Pegasus to countries that are looking to fight terror or fight crime. And the problem is that in some countries around the world, political dissidents, and I don't mean like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter kind of arguments, but real, very clear, no questionable political activity, that can be considered terrorism, or that can be considered a crime. And so you're sort of, that's the way with a wink and a nod for a country to say, we'll only use this technology to fight terror when that terror is actually being used against political activists. So part of it is legislation to strengthen the controls on defense exports. This has been raised a few times. There was almost every year or so, there has been a bill put forward that would block Israeli companies from being able to sell to human rights abusers. There have been times where people have signed on to, where large numbers of politicians from across the political spectrum have signed on to it. But part of the reason they sign on to it is because they know that it's not really going anywhere. It doesn't really cost anything to sign on to this bill. But in the end, there's lots of money to be made, and there's diplomatic considerations and political considerations and foreign policy. And so in the end, this never really goes anywhere. There's no one currently in the government who's really forcefully pushing for this. But that's sort of the answer. There was until the end of last year, until earlier this year, the courts could intervene in some cases. You could petition the courts to take away an export license if the weapons or cyber surveillance tools or whatever it was being used to violate human rights. But earlier this year, Israel's Supreme Court ruled that that very rarely results, like that tactic very rarely resulted in export licenses actually being taken away. But sort of to seal the deal that this was not a way to prevent these kinds of arms sales, earlier this year, the Supreme Court ruled that this is just not subject to judicial review, that these decisions are being made by the defense with input from the foreign ministry, and sort of that's, except for exceedingly gross abuses, the courts sort of don't, you can't file a petition with the courts anymore. So that was a way to sort of address these, but now the only way for Israel to do anything is to pass new legislation.
Thank you.
Sure.
Joe, did you want to ask your question?
Judah, is there any way for a person to check their phone to see if it's been infected with this?
There are some companies that do that. That's partially how this came out. There was a few firms who could review a phone and if Pegasus was on there, but that's not something that an average person could sort of see. There's no application or something that's suddenly downloaded, but people who are really skilled in that kind of what's the word? In that kind of digital investigation could sort of suss out.
Yeah, Julia.
Do we know when there was reporting that some of our journalists were targeted in terms of their, being surveilled? Do we know if we've had any problems in the United States?
As far as I don't believe there were U.S. journalists. There might be American nationals that I'm not sure, but in terms of there were a few American journalists who worked for either American or British, but English language sort of outlets that were part of this. The U.S. was not, the main. The U.S. was not sort of directly involved in this. This was more in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia. Those countries sort of were more involved in this particular sort of scandal. But there were a few like Middle East correspondents for American or British who were sort of caught up in this.
Yeah, Harvey. Oh, sorry. Did you want to say more, Judah?
No, it's fine.
All right. Yeah, Harvey.
Is there any information as to whether this technology can be replicated or pirated if it gets in the hands of a rogue nation?
I mean, I think that's always a consideration, but that's not sort of the main concern here, they're normally pretty good about sort of building in their about keeping their specific ways of gaining access to different phones. So that's not such an issue. I mean, there are other ways of sort of reaching and breaking into people's phones, and sort of it's a truism that everybody spies on everybody. So that's sort of, there are other companies that are out there that are working to break phones. There's also an Israeli company called Celebrate, which is in it every now and then. And there's, I mean, no shortage whatsoever of other private companies and countries that are putting in lots of efforts into breaking into people's phones. Yeah.
Yeah, Julia.
So, dovetailing to what you just said, do we know if Russia and China has any of this type of technology that they can kind of replicate the same type of way to, target political opponents? Or
so in general, yes. I mean, to this level of sophistication or whatever, maybe not. This was kind of considered the sort of gold standard of cyber surveillance technology, but you don't necessarily need to have the best of the best of the best. You can get somebody to click on a link, download a file, whatever it is, and at that point it's sort of anyone's. In terms of, just on a separate note, there's for people's own sort of personal, nowhere near an expert on this, but it's always good to update your phones when there's new sort of patches that get put out for software, because normally those come because somebody has found out that there's an issue or a security breach or whatever, and these are ways to fix them. But there's, this is not my area of expertise. I have some friends who know much better than I, but just as a general rule, it's always to update and install the patches that you're supposed to. But this well, I sort of mentioned this was in general, it's we're somewhat but one of the things that's sort of raised as an issue with Pegasus, with NSO Group, and with all of this, is that we're really entering into a world in terms of cyber surveillance that we don't fully know the rules of. We have rules for in terms of international agreements and international treaties on the use of nuclear weapons, on the use of biological and chemical weapons. We don't really have things for cyber attacks and cyber surveillance and things like that, partially just because it's a newer technology. It hasn't been, and a lot of these rules are sort of still being written today in terms of what's considered acceptable and what sort of are. So there have been a number of voices that have been coming out in light of the NSO Group sort of expose, saying that we should be clear that this type of cyber surveillance should be forbidden sort of in international treaties, and that people who do it should be punished in some way in order to prevent this from becoming as common and widespread as it currently is, because right now we just sort of don't know. And so everyone's sort of doing whatever they can because no one's saying they can't. And so that's sort of something on a higher level of government in terms of multilateral treaties and things like that. But for the time being, if you want to be sure that nobody is hearing the conversation that you're having, have it in a room without a phone. Because right now everything is, most people aren't listening to you because you're not, I'm saying myself included, not that interesting. But when there are those conversations that are significant or whatever, that you have concern that somebody's listening, and I hold this true, like for myself as well, don't bring the phone into the room for that conversation, because it's in this day and age, it's incredibly easy for someone to hack into your phone, either private companies or whatever. So in terms of a general rule of thumb, if you really want to make sure that nobody's overhearing your conversation, have a room without phones and computers and AirPods and Apple Watches and so on.
So Judah, what's the role of the companies in all of this? You know, I mean, with like, is Apple working to make their phones harder to hack, or you know, the other phone companies using Android? I mean, or is this just kind of like we're going to keep building a better mousetrap and we're going to keep getting a better mouse?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely how this plays out. I mean, NSO Group, before this came out, was facing lawsuits from WhatsApp, which is now owned by Facebook, because NSO Group had breached WhatsApp and was using WhatsApp in ways that WhatsApp didn't want them to. So there's definitely a lot of, and the Celebrite company that I mentioned is sort of in this bizarre back and forth with a company called Signal, which makes an encrypted messaging application. Basically, Celebrite had boasted that it figured out how to beat Signal, and Signal sort of responded by messing with Celebrite's technology and potentially hacking them. And these companies sort of are going back and forth. Apple sort of famously refused to breach the iPhone of there was the Islamic State shooting in California a few years ago, and they tried to get into, the FBI was trying to get access to the shooter's phone, and Apple refused to do that. In the end, there was a lot of reporting that an Israeli company had gotten into the phone, but earlier this year, or maybe at the end of last year, it turned out it wasn't an Israeli company, it was an Australian company, because they're quietly very good at cyber attacks and cyber defense. So this is something that's sort of ongoing between the companies and between these types of cyber surveillance firms. And so there's a lot of sort of pushback on that, but a lot of it sort of is going to come down to some combination of companies keeping up and making sure there are no holes in their security, and also legislation that's preventing this kind of thing. But it's that kind of legislation is a little bit difficult to do, because every country wants to be able to have this technology when it wants it. For in the cases of when there's a shooting attack and you want to have access to the person's phone, you want to have that technology sort of in existence, but it's kind of hard to get that type of technology in existence, but then not allow people to sort of profit off of it. So that's sort of the constant sort of push and pull in this kind of a thing.
And so just to follow up, because we have some questions also in the chat.
Yeah.
Other than legislation, you know, is there anything that individuals can be doing? Is there any kind of detection software, you know, or is that something that's under development? And I'm kind of expanding on this. I could sort of imagine this becomes like a new area, right? Suddenly we're paying companies to then be monitoring our phones for us for these things who are, you know, is this sort of just like the new front lines of hacking and of how we're all going to be in technology?
I'm a little bit pessimistic about this. So sort of as you've said, like as you've mentioned, this is always a back and forth and one, you know, a game of cat and mouse. One side gets better, the other side gets better, the other side gets better, the other side gets better. But there's always going to be companies and groups that want to be able to read your emails and listen to your phone calls and so on and so forth. And obviously people want to have privacy. So there's always this back and forth going on between the two. So in terms of us as individuals wanting to sort of protect ourselves, again, I'm like, this is not my area of expertise. I can try to find you a few websites that, or a few articles and websites that might be able to help. But this is something that digital products are sort of out there. Does that mean that someone is looking at every photo you take on your phone? No, probably not, because it's not that interesting. So no one's going to take the amount of time to see what you're doing. That's changing a little bit as time goes on, because artificial intelligence is getting better. So suddenly you don't need, a person listening in on a phone call. You can have artificial intelligence program sort of listening in for keywords and seeing, different markers and doing that, which makes sort of mass surveillance more possible as the technology allows it. But for us as individuals, I would say that the answer lies in being aware that most things that you're doing are hackable. And if there's something you want to make sure is not getting out there, to not leave it in a digital format on your phone or computer. And make sure that you're having conversations that you want to keep just between you and the other person or the other people, in rooms that are not full of electronics that you're we don't really have it in Israel, but the like Google Home and Amazon, what is it, a Dot? I don't even know. I'm not, we don't have it, so I don't know the names of the products, but like that you're not having, I don't want to sound like an old person. It's just not a technology that I have access to. Not old person is not nice. I should say Luddite, who's, just opposed to technology. I'm just not familiar enough with it. But yeah, taking that seriously and going into another room and leaving your phone somewhere else. But sort of beyond that, there's not too much that you can really do on a personal level. Again, as I said, sort of updating your phone regularly. There are applications that are out there that provide for some better level of encryption than your normal sort of text messaging. WhatsApp has basic encryption. Telegram, Signal, like none of these are perfect. And there's some really high levels of encryption that are out there. There's Proton Mail instead of Gmail. You can use Google Chrome, just in terms of not governments necessarily tracking you, but companies tracking you. Google Chrome is watching everything that you do. If you have a Facebook window on your browser, they're seeing every other website that you're going to. So there's other browsers besides Google Chrome and other sort of options that are out there for people where that's an area of concern. But part of it is just educating yourself and really looking out there. But I, as somebody who tries to educate myself and read up and follow sort of the best practices, I'm also aware that at the end of the day, if I don't want something to be available, like I need to take a number of concepts to make it as difficult for someone to get access to as possible. But it's a little, if somebody really wants to get that picture off my phone or that picture off my computer, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter what I do about it. Like where there's a will, there's a way in terms of these kinds of things. But that's sort of in the digital realm, and that's sort of just the basic thing is there's steps that you can take to make yourself a little bit safer. And if there's something that's really important, to go that much further, but know that sort of at the end of the day, it's a really hard time for privacy right now.
For people would always tease us because my husband works, as in technology, and yet like we would never let any of those things into our house, like I think for all of these reasons, right? He's been neurotic about this for years before these stories broke. Yeah, Jane, you have a question.
Well, I joined a few minutes late, so I may have missed a little bit of this, but I'm sort of interested a bit into what we sort of think. One of the reasons we came attuned, I guess we started hearing about this, was the potential backlash it could cause for Israel and relations between Israel and other countries. And then I know last month we read something about the Dimona project and whatever, Wall Street or New York Times. And, certain things it seems like Israel is allowed, or because of some understanding that maybe we all don't have a handle on, is allowed to develop and do things that other countries maybe can't get away with. And I know that in the next month, I think we have a meeting or two scheduled with with the Midwest Consul General. And I'm wondering what you think, I sort of missed right at the beginning, you were talking about the Supreme Court and what they know and what Israel's doing. Is Israel concerned about this? Is their PR department trying to brush this under the rug? Is it something that they're concerned about for their own security and safety? And I'm trying to figure out where all that lies.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the question. This sort of brings it into an area that I'm happy to talk about. I sort of mentioned earlier on, this is the area of defense exports, not just cyber products, but earlier guns and boats and armored personnel carriers and what have you. It's all been a way Israel has seen this, and not only Israel, the United States and Russia do this literally more than anybody. It's a way of shoring up relations. It's a way of, there's a country like Myanmar. You want to make sure that Myanmar will not vote against you in the UN, and Myanmar wants to buy your patrol boats. So you sell Myanmar your patrol boats, even though Myanmar is doing horrifying things to the Rohingya. Same thing with South Africa during apartheid, with Guatemala and a number of other countries in Central and South America during some horrific crackdowns and ethnic cleansings and genocides there. Same with Rwanda during the genocide there. It's the goal isn't to contribute to the atrocities that are happening. It's a way to shore up relations with these countries. And that's sort of the justification that normally comes out. In some cases, it's also it can also be security benefits. So in the case of South Sudan, Israel for a while was selling weapons to South Sudan, and at the same time as there was some pretty horrific violence happening there during its civil war. Now Israel sort of maintained that it was not selling weapons for use in the civil war, though there were some indications that it was being used for that. More so in terms of Israel was hoping to give weapons to South Sudan that South Sudan would use against Sudan, which now Israel is normalizing ties with. But at the time, Sudan was aligned with Iran, was helping Hamas, was sort of very much in this axis that Israel opposed. So by arming South Sudan, which is enemies with Sudan, Israel's kind of helping itself. So there's those considerations as well. But sort of as we're seeing here with NSO Group, there are times when that can blow back on you, when the details of defense exports can come to light. And so in the case of this, is the whatever value was gained by approving arms sales to Bahrain, offset by the sort of mini, maybe not even mini, but the sort of the great tensions that sort of broke out between Israel and France after it turned out that Macron was apparently sort of on this list of people who were being who they had tried to use Pegasus against. So there's always a bit of that as well. I think it's the fact that Israel had good relations with South Africa, including arms sales to South Africa during apartheid, and the horrible relationship that Israel has with South Africa today. I think that those two things are certainly connected. And so there's always this, Israel's looking to improve its diplomatic standing through these arms sales, but at the same time, these arms sales can also sort of come back and bite you in the butt. And so that's something that Israel is certainly aware of. Israeli officials were absolutely responded to these reports coming out about NSO Group. And so they are taking action because nobody wants to see this type of story sort of being the story about Israel that's on the front page of newspapers around the country. In terms of the PR spin, there was sort of an effort to say that this was blown out of proportion, that this was just people looking to make Israel look bad. I as an Israeli, I don't necessarily buy that. I mean, I think Obviously, a good deal, in sort of my personal opinion, obviously, when there's a country that's using cyber surveillance against political dissidents and journalists, sort of that's abhorrent behavior, and it's primarily, you know, the country that's doing that, that's, you know, doing the cyber surveillance on a political activist. But at the same time, for Israel to know that it's selling this type of really powerful, incredibly powerful technology to countries that have very iffy at best human rights records is also problematic behavior. Is it worse than the actual spying on political opponents? No. Is it still bad behavior that should be corrected and not allowed to continue? Yes, in my opinion. So I think there's that side of things in terms of how this was sort of spun by Israeli officials. But at the same time, I think there was a bit of people did become aware that they needed to do a little bit more to oversee these types of defense exports, specifically because it looks really bad splashed across the front page of the Washington Post.
Thank you.
So to follow up on that, Judah, I'm curious. Obviously, I think there's sometimes a disconnect between how we in the American Jewish community envision the Israel that we want to have, and then the real Israel on the ground that has political negotiations and, you know, lives among the nations of the world, and, you know, politics is messy and real life is messy, and that's going to be and I think I'm hearing you kind of touch upon that in some ways. I am curious, in navigating through this space, and I don't know that you would know what's happening in the insider conversations, but, you know, would Israel be taking under consideration in any way, or thinking about I'm going to hesitate to say the American Jewish community, because it seems like that's not always a factor, you know, in the same sort of way. I don't know that we sort of have that kind of influence, but like the American relationship, like what role, you know, is this something that America is okay with? America is not, like, is there a way in which America can kind of say to Israel, like, we don't want to give you defense spending if you're going to then be developing this technology and giving it to these other nations? Like, what role do others have in this?
I mean, America has its own sordid history with providing arms and intelligence capabilities and cyber capabilities to countries that it probably shouldn't. So as an Israeli and an American, if America sort of came and tried to say, oh, Israel, you really can't do that. I mean, a lot of the Emirati intelligence and a lot of the Saudi intelligence capabilities are coming with a lot of help from the United States, including from former American intelligence officers that sort of go and work as private consultants in these countries that now Israel, you know, is all, it's a bit of a mess. I don't think that America has the sort of moral standing to dictate arms sales to, you know, what's an unacceptable arms sale to Israel. At the same time, for Israel, this doesn't look good. I mean, it doesn't look good when America has similar things as well, but it also doesn't look good sort of for Israel. So I think sort of you mentioned that I would not say that there's definitely I mean, there's growing voices calling for Israel to, you know, not sell arms to human rights violators. I'm not necessarily a proponent of selling arms to human rights violators, but like you said, Israel lives in the world and it does want to have relations with different countries, and sometimes a way of doing that is through arms sales. Israel wants to have a very good relationship with Azerbaijan, for instance. Azerbaijan, for a long time, was selling to Israel like a third of its fuel was coming from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan also shares a very long border with Iran, a large Jewish community. It's a Muslim country. It's a good country for Israel to have ties with. It also spies on its own people, is horrifically corrupt, specifically the family of the president. It has this ongoing war with Armenia, which both sides are kind of horrific to one another on. It's not an easy thing. How do you maintain, good ties with a country with a bad human rights record like Azerbaijan? So there are cases where maybe at the end of the day, it winds up that you say, yep, sell them the drones, and make sure that they don't use the drones on civilians, but sell them the drones. That really does need to, those are sort of the types of questions that need to be answered by defense ministries and foreign ministries and prime ministers and so on. But Israel in general is a country that for a long time had very bad diplomatic relations with large parts of the world. And as a result, it's always looking to improve its ties and make friends sort of anywhere it can find them. And sometimes it means selling weapons to countries that you don't have to, that are going to use them for nefarious purposes. And in cases like that, you would think that Israel would not sell the weapons in that case. So there's a bit of going, of balancing that act of trying to be just a moral country and a country with like everyone else, and also the realpolitik of international relations and making allies and keeping allies. So obviously it's a bit of a balancing act, I think, but currently and in part because there's a severe lack of transparency in these kinds of deals, that balancing act is skewed and is not really in a good and sort of tenable place. So I would hope to see that change. Just to sort of touch on the transparency, there is almost no transparency, which is also why there's not a huge amount of reporting from within Israel about these types of arms sales. There's in no way whatsoever are companies required to sort of publicly announce any sales that they make. There can also be censorship in terms of the military censor and gag orders. A lot of the hearings that can be heard if there's allegations that Israeli weapons are being used by human rights violators, a lot of the court hearings will be held sort of behind closed doors. In a lot of cases, the people filing the petition to get the courts to intervene will not even be able to hear the defense, the government's arguments. This is an entirely process. When the government is supposed to, as I said before, is supposed to sort of take into consideration the end use and the end users, sort of those deliberations are, completely secret and classified. So I think that part of the problem and part of the reason why this sort of continues through the decades is because no one knows about it, and the people who know about it don't talk about it, and there's sort of active censorship, as well as just sort of a general culture of not talking about these things. And so that's why most of the information that comes out about Israeli arms sales comes out from the United Nations, from Human Rights Watch, from other sort of international NGOs. And a lot of those NGOs, for right or wrong reasons, do not have are not particularly respected in Israel. And so when they put out these reports about Israeli weapons that are being used in South Sudan, it's very easy for Israelis to sort of brush them under the rug and not really pay attention to them because it's coming from a source that has its own biases and issues with Israel and the Palestinians.
So you mentioned that this is an area where there really isn't any international regulation. So I'm thinking about that right in the context. I think like part of what also scares us is this idea of, Russia could have this technology and be spying on American citizens or whatnot. But I think we at least sort of imagine that within countries there's regulation, right? Like America is not supposed to be able to spy on its own citizens without warrants or things like that. I assume, I mean, what kind of regulations are there within Israel itself? And is there conversation about the technology used like
yeah,
in
so
Israel itself?
this type of, I mean, it comes up. I mean, it came up most recently in terms of the coronavirus. At the start of the pandemic, the government brought in the Shin Bet, which has a whole host of capabilities, most of which are classified to sort of track people. This technology was being used that relies on cell phones and credit card data and sort of everything else, every other sort of digital footprint that we leave to track people's movements. And this was being used against Israeli citizens for the first time. Now, this is used overwhelmingly against Palestinians, but it's not normally used against Israeli citizens. And this was being used for the coronavirus. And so it was given, it was controversial, but not that controversial in Israel. And it sort of went ahead and was used for a while until at a certain point, it was just determined that it wasn't necessary anymore. In general, Israel has a different relationship with concepts of privacy than in the United States. The United States, that's sort of very much a concept that exists. There's even, in general, American society is a bit more libertarian about the role of government and really doesn't want government to be involved. That doesn't exist to the same level in Israel, partially because Israelis sort of just, I think it's a bad thing. I think people should be more concerned about their privacy and whatever. But in general, I think part of the feeling in Israel is that this is a country that's under legitimate threat of attack sort of on a regular basis. And so Israelis are sort of more willing to accept violations of their privacy and more willing to accept violations of their civil liberties if it means more safety for them. And so in the case of the coronavirus, like it was a similar thing where there was a bit of discomfort, but okay, I mean, it wasn't a big fight. If this was attempted in the United States, I think you would see, I mean, huge swaths of the American body politics sort of losing collective mind. In Israel, that was not the case so much, just because there's not a culture of privacy here to the same extent. So NSO Group is not necessarily being used, though bizarrely, Naftali Bennett, now Prime Minister, then Defense Minister, did want to bring in NSO Group to assist in some of the coronavirus tracking early on in the pandemic, but that never actually panned out, just as a little side note, but yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm just noticing the time, so we might have time for one short question. I don't know if anyone has a burning final question before we close out. Okay, I'm going to assume that, oh, Jane, did you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to say thanks. No more questions.
No, yes, this has been really fascinating. Judah, thank you for going through all of this. There's a lot here that's pretty concerning, and a lot here to think about and understand. And also, I think to really help us understand, sort of as I was saying before, I think oftentimes in the American Jewish community, so much of our conversations about Israel have to do with our own relationships to Israel, which is obviously incredibly important, but sometimes we have blinders on to like also Israel in terms of who it's trying to be and its own negotiations. And so, you know, just because I might have personal feelings about a certain country doesn't mean it's not incredibly advantageous for Israel to have diplomatic relationships with that country, right? And how do we really understand what it is? I feel like, right, in any relationship, there's sort of your idea of a person, and then there's like the real person who's behind it. And so helping us to unpack all of this and helping us to also understand the story as it comes up. And I think particularly you reference some of the ways that the story is potentially also skewed or kind of emphasized in different ways because of the overlay of Israel in particular. And so the ways in which many countries are engaging in this, the ways in which Israel has particular strengths in the area of cybersecurity and cyber hacking and all of those, and then the ways in which this conversation is sort of, happening with the overlay of every other conflict and everything else that's currently going on in the world. So thank you for taking your night to unpack all that.
Absolutely. I'll just add one more sort of short thing. There is sort of an interesting group that's forming against these types of arms sales. And it's a group that's being led primarily by what would otherwise be considered sort of right-wing religious Israelis. There's a guy named Eli Joseph who has been sort of very active in this. There's another man named Avidan Friedman who's been part of this. It's a small group. They haven't really had any real success, but they do sort of hold protests, and they come at it from a sort of religious, moral perspective, and not, from a more sort of left-wing, secular, liberal perspective of human rights, but just as a sort of religiously that Israel shouldn't be, sort of on a moral level, Israel shouldn't be doing this. And also just, I don't know if I mentioned, but I sort of definitely want to make clear that this is something that Israel has been doing when it was led by very left-wing governments, by very right-wing governments. It's definitely something that sort of exists. There's also, I didn't really get into this so much, but there's a troubling sort of revolving door of people who go from defense positions in the military and then go into start working for defense contractors and then go into government and sort of cycle through. And that also sort of helps lubricate this process and allows these types of sales to go forward, because you don't want to mess up your friend's arms sale and prevent him from making, however much money. So there's definitely that side of things, which is also something to sort of keep in mind, which again, sort of as you mentioned, like Israel's a country. This is something that happens overwhelmingly in the United States, overwhelmingly in Russia, and throughout Europe. This is into Australia more and more, but they sort of are just quietly hanging out with kangaroos so people don't notice. It's certainly something to sort of be aware of, I think. And I wish it were discussed more within Israel, and certainly also sort of for American Jews to be aware of and to grapple with. I don't necessarily have an answer for everything on this. I think there's some things that I think you can sort of take a clear stance on. It's definitely something to grapple with and to think about.
Well, thank you. I know I'm definitely leaving with a lot more to think about and some more questions and like kind of a new fear of Australia. So that's something I'm gonna sit with for the rest of the day. Thank you, Judah. Thank you all for joining us during what maybe was your lunch hour. And Judah, we'll wish you a good night. Thank you all, and more programs to come. So stay tuned.